here. Recording. Okay. All right. Sorry about that, folks. Okay. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. My name is Kirsten, and together with my sister Lynn, we created the AntiRacist Table, which is a multi-dimensional platform aimed at educating Americans about anti-Blackness and its legacy, rehumanizing, creating empathy, and motivating action to dismantle systemic racism. Today's topic is one that's near and dear to our hearts. We are both moms. Lynn is an educator, and in the history of Black Americans, starting with the slave codes that made it illegal for enslaved people to be taught to learn to read or write, continuing through many years of denial of education and access to education for Black people in America. Those are things that have played a critical role in some of the issues that we still face in America today. And Black children deserve a fair shot at life, and they deserve equal access to education. And last night, if you watched President-elect Joe Biden's victory speech, he mentioned that America's educators, this is a great day that you guys are going to have one of your own in the White House. And both President-elect and the VP-elect spoke about the need to dismantle systemic racism. So you guys are here today, so we know that you're doing this work and you're committed to doing this work. We have many educators and faculties doing our free 30-day challenge, which provides a framework and a safe space to begin doing this critical foundational work that tackles anti-Blackness and systemic racism. Our challenge is wonderful for families, parents, your colleagues to help create a supportive network to do this work, to create a team of allies and champions for equity in education and anti-racism in education. This is work that is very challenging if you're doing it alone, for sure, and to have that support can really be critical. We also want to mention that DC public school teachers can receive PLUs for doing our 30-day challenge. We'll share the link in the chat and also have that available. And if you're an educator someplace else and you are interested in getting PLUs, please email us. You can email us at info@theantiracist.table.com and put us in touch with the PLU is professional learning units. So you can get credit for that as part of your continuing education. But if you are not in DC and you're interested in trying to get PLUs, if you put us in touch with whoever is in charge in your school district, in your school, who issues those, we will be happy to reach out to them to share our challenge curriculum and to see if you can get that too. So we have a very exciting series. Actually, we'll talk about that later. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my sister, Lynn, who is going to do a land acknowledgement. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. It's very important for us to really settle in to where we are, to be aware of the land that we are living on, to thinking about the indigenous people who were here before us. And so with that intention, Kirsten and I always begin all of our events with a land acknowledgement, and we particularly like one that we've been using for quite some time. It's inspired by Ruth King, who is a meditation mindfulness practitioner. She's African American. You can Google her. She's amazing. But I'll begin our land acknowledgement now. I would like to share this land acknowledgement. I would like to call my ancestors to stand with me as I acknowledge the native custodians of this land, Washington, D.C. and Silver Spring, Maryland, who are the Anacostan Piscataway people. Those people that are named, unnamed, those people that are known and unknown, that are past and present. We honor all traditions and traditional custodians of this region. We recognize the continued connection with the land and with the water and with the community. We pay our respects to the earth, whose generous resources sustain us on a daily basis. And we pay respect to the enslaved African people of this land who were brought here, who were held here and were sold here, and all of their descendants. And all of the people throughout the world who are in captivity. We pay respect to their spiritual labor, and we pay respect to our ancestors, whose unwise relationship to race and racism we have inherited. We pay respect to our teachers and to our elders, past and present, and all of the emerging young people who are teaching us today. We honor this gathering, everyone that is here, and our special guests who have taken the time and energy to be with us today and share their wisdom. May we recognize that we all share an aspiration for liberation to be free in heart, mind, and body. Ashe. Here ends the land acknowledgement. And with that, Kirsten will introduce our panelists.
Thank you. We are beyond excited today to have Jordan Starck, Robert Hendricks, and Vanessa Ann Williams today. Jordan Starck is a graduate student at Princeton University, where he studies race, bias, and interventions for social change. He is also the co-author of Teachers Are People Too: Racial Bias Among American Educators. Robert Hendricks is the founder and executive director of He Is Me Institute, a college fellows program recruiting Black men as teachers. He is the author of Why Do We Need Black Male Teachers and How Do We Get Them to Obtain and Retain Teaching Jobs. Vanessa Ann Williams has a master's in education, culture, and society from the University of Pennsylvania and is a social studies and civics and economics teacher. She has developed her own critical social studies curriculum. She is also the author of Statutes Are Only One Kind of Monument to White Supremacy. So with that, we want to welcome you, and we can give you a chance if anybody wants to do their own land acknowledgement from our trio. You can do that now. If not, we'll go right into the first question. Okay, so Lynn, do you want to move to the next slide? So here our first question: implicit and explicit bias in educators. How does it show up in the classroom, and what can be done to mitigate it? And this one, we'd like to direct this question to Jordan Starck.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for the question, Kirsten, and thank you and Lynn for your leadership on this and creating the space. And for everyone who's with us today, thank you for taking the time on a Sunday afternoon to do this important work. So I think this question that's posed right now about bias in educators is super important, and it's something that I study along with my collaborators. And the question asks about implicit and explicit bias in education. There's been a lot of attention given recently to the distinction between implicit and explicit bias. And I don't want to get too deep into it, but it's really just when we talk about explicit bias versus implicit bias, we're talking about biases that occur on a continuum of how much direct cognitive control, attention, and awareness someone can give to their behaviors and to their thoughts. So explicit is stuff that's more effortful, more reflective. I know that I have these beliefs, whereas implicit biases refer to things that can occur sort of more automatic. And I hope to give an example of exactly what I mean by that a little bit later on. But regardless of the difference in types of bias, what we know in our research, regardless of how you measure it, whether you're talking about implicit or explicit bias, you're measuring bias feelings, bias ideologies, or bias cognitions or conceptual representations that people have, teachers have biases that are on par with the rest of the population. Just point blank period. And that's not surprising to a lot of folks, but it's worth mentioning because it really underscores the point that no matter how well-intentioned a population is, no matter how much experience they have working with diverse groups of people, neither of those factors is sufficient to mitigate against the threat of having biases, right? So we know that implicit and explicit biases occur in teachers at a relatively high level. About 77% of teachers show some level of implicit anti-Black bias. And these biases really do matter in the classroom for the educational experiences of students. Biases can show up in teachers' expectations of students. They can influence the instructional quality that teachers have for their classroom. They can influence the pedagogical choices teachers have in terms of how they're thinking about interacting with their students, and they can influence the extent to which teachers are concerned with fostering a mutually respectful classroom environment. So all of these things obviously can conspire to create an environment in which minority students have worse academic achievement to the extent that their teachers are biased. And also teachers' biases are related to how teachers discipline students, right? So really these biases can affect all aspects of the educational environment and can have direct outcomes in terms of racial achievement gaps, both in terms of educational attainment and in terms of disciplinary achievement gaps, right? So it's really, really important, affecting all aspects of the educational environment. But it's really hard to talk about what can be done about it. This is a really important question, but also like a really complicated question. And I'm going to do just a brief little exercise to try to illustrate why it's so complicated. And this exercise is a little bit of a risk doing it on Zoom, but I'm going to trust that you all will do it with me. And I hope that it works with the technology. Okay. So I'm going to say a list of words, and I want you to repeat after me each of the words that I say. And then I'm going to ask a question, and I want you to answer the question. Don't repeat the question, just answer it. So list the words, repeat each word, and then answer the question that I ask you, okay? Please do it aloud with me. First word, bop.
Bop.
Top.
Top.
Blop.
Blop.
Prop. Cop. Now, what do you do when you come to a green light? All right, people are holding their heads like, oh, damn, they're gonna take my driver's license. What happens? Many of us at home are saying you stop when you come to a green light. Obviously, that's not true. I'm sure that all you licensed folks and even you unlicensed folks know better that that's not how you should behave on the road when you come to a green light. Now, why is it that people are saying stop? Obviously, I created a pattern for you. I created a rhyme. I was saying everything at a certain rhythm, and you just completed that pattern. Usually that's good. Our brains are amazing at doing that. That's what our brains are supposed to do. But sometimes it causes us to behave in ways that we don't want to behave in ways that we know better than to behave in, right? And so when we talk about mitigating bias, we have to talk about a few things. One is people's beliefs, right? So how do I just get you to believe when you come to that green light, you're supposed to go, right? I think in our society, we've taken for granted, at least for the last few years, that we know how to change people's beliefs when the terms comes down to racial attitudes. But that in and of itself is really, really hard, and really hard to do well, and really hard to do in a way that lasts. So that's much harder than I think we think it is. And I think we take for granted that we know how to change people's beliefs, but that's super hard in and of itself. But part of the bigger problem is the belief itself isn't what often drives people's behavior. It's a part of it, but there's this broader social context. There's a broader social context of people saying bop, drop, cop, flop, right? That's affecting how people behave, right? And so in our society, when we're talking about anti-Black attitudes, we have a whole culture that have representations, stereotypical representations about what it means to be Black, what it means to be white, what it means to be all these different social identities, right? And these stereotypical representations are a part of our sort of thought space, regardless of whether or not we believe them, right? And they can influence us at times when we don't want them to influence us, right? And so when we talk about changing these biased attitudes, we also have to change that broader social context. And that's really hard because it's not just changing stereotypical representations, right? So we could talk about changing the media. We could talk about having positive role models. We could talk about all sorts of things to change who do we think of as like a good student and who's a bad student, or who do we think of as smart or dangerous or any of these things. But it's also linked to status. and the status that different groups have in our society. So there's some really good research that's showing that, the stereotypes that people have flow from the status of groups in our society. That stereotypes aren't random, right? And so in order to start mitigating the effects of the biases that people have access to in their head that then pop up in bad moments, we also need to be giving attention to how do we change our society structurally, right? And so when we talk about what can be done about teachers' biases, we have to give thought to how do we stop people from having these social environments that are giving them the bop, drops, cops, tops, and that requires structural change, that requires policy change, right? But that's not practical for teachers right now, right? That's a long sort of horizon thing that needs to happen. So what can people do in the interim? Well, in the interim, we need to be thinking about how do we break the link between these biased cognitions that people have, right? And perhaps their biased behaviors and students' outcomes. How do we protect students from these biases that we know exist? When we know it's hard to change beliefs, it's going to take a very long time to change society, right? And so we don't have a lot of good research about how to do that, to be honest. So my underlying goal I'm going to ask everybody to think about is how to create some partnerships with researchers so we can have some better answers to these questions. But the general idea is we want to break the link between teachers' latent biases or the biases that they can have access to, because it doesn't have to be just people's personal beliefs, the biases that we have access to. How do we break the link between that and student outcomes? And there are two key concepts to keep in mind with that: opportunity and motivation. Right? We want to give people the opportunity to overcome the biases that they have access to in their cognitive representations. And we want to motivate them to do that. Right? And so when I say the opportunity, we can do things such as, for example, allowing ourselves or encouraging our peers to grade blindly. So we don't even know who the students are that we're grading so that our biases can't leak through, right? One of the other things we know is that these biases that we have access to tend to come out when we're tired, when things are ambiguous, right? When we're grading that 80th paper at midnight, right? That's when these things sort of come out. So we can pay attention to the situations that afford themselves to more biased behaviors and try to do all that we can to stop those situations from happening, right? So opportunity is one broad thing to pay attention to, and then trying to encourage people, motivate people to overcome the biases that might pop up when that first thought is to stop at the green light. When that comes in your head, how do you pause and then override that, right? And you can motivate people through norms, right? And you can motivate people through accountability, right? Accountability can be really powerful, right? And so accountability does not have to be race-specific accountability. So if we're talking about grading or whatever the situation is, you don't have to sit down and think, why am I giving my Black students these grades and my white students these grades? It can be as simple as, for each student that you grade a paper, you should be prepared to articulate why that grade is what it is, right? And so there needs to be a rubric that you can be accountable to, right? Or feeling that I'm going to want to be able to explain this to parents or be able to explain this to my principal, right? That sense of accountability goes a long way from you to sort of go on this quick judgment. Oh, this student probably got B-, I don't know, to really think about what did you see in the paper that's justifying the grade. And when we take that little extra bit of effort, we reduce the extent to which we're relying on those sort of cognitive shortcuts that can be biased, right? So those are two general principles we should think about. But really, I want to emphasize that the research really isn't there yet about how do we break this bias and how do we do it well at a large scale and at a meaningful degree, right? So we really need more research. We really need more collaborations about how to break these links. But we need to know that diversity training is not enough. The research literature is clear on that right now. Diversity training is not enough. It can even backfire, right? And just thinking about people as being well-intentioned or having good beliefs isn't enough either. All right, so we got to think very strategically about how to move forward with that. So that's my quick soapbox version. I have a lot more I could say, but I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much, Jordan. That was very thorough and covered a lot of territory. I don't know if anyone has anything to add. If not, I'm sure there's plenty to add, but we could go on to the next question. Lynn?
Yes.
So we're hearing an echo, Lynn.
Hold on, let me just have two devices going on.
Yes, you guys will have access to the recording. And sorry, I'm trying to I thought I put links to everybody's materials, but I only sent it to the panelists, so I'm going to do it again. I can go ahead and do this question. Lynn, it sounds like Lynn's having some technical issues. So this is, can you talk to us about the need for Black boys and students to have Black male teachers? Why does it matter? How can you create an environment that supports Black teacher retention? And that question is for Robert Hendricks.
Thank you. Good morning or afternoon to everybody here. First, I'll say that Jordan's response to the previous question is a really strong backdrop to the answer to this question. I think there's two cohorts of people to really work on with this. And one is more systemic, which Jordan referred to, um, really digging into the biases of teachers, knowing the population of teachers that we have. And the other one is a response to this question, which is to get more people who not necessarily already, there's no such thing as being unbiased, but at least not to the same extent or degree, usually, because they share the same cultural background and a lot of different identities, and that is Black men. So to answer your question, first I'll say that 70% of Black children grow up in single mother homes, and that starts to have a very early impact on boys. So they early in their lives, they don't have, oftentimes they don't have a lot of consistent positive Black role models, Black male role models at home and in their neighborhoods. And that's not a commentary on Black men, it's more of a commentary on the systems surrounding Black men, which can be a whole nother panel discussion in and of itself. But when we look a little bit deeper into that, when we just look at the lowest income bracket of children and we compare boys to girls, even from the same household, the girls are 8.5 times more likely to be ready for school. That's like socialized for school and like get in less trouble. And that's evidenced by looking only at preschool suspension rates. 45% of preschoolers who are suspended are Black boys. And when you're suspended once, it increases the likelihood that you're suspended twice. And the more suspensions you get, the more likely you are to be expelled and then drop out and then be incarcerated and then be poor in adulthood. And then the cycle repeats itself generation after generation. And what makes that even more jarring is that 97% of school infractions are discretionary, meaning that the teacher or the school administrator, they're objective by making the judgment that something is wrong. Those are things like disrespect or the student is threatening. 3% of all school infractions are things like weapons or drugs or alcohol, something that's more clear cut. The rest of them are relying on the perception of the adult in the room. And then if we look at Black male teachers, the opposite actually happens. Fewer students of all demographics, fewer students get in trouble, at least are sent to the principal's or dean's office, and that leads to higher achievement in Black male teachers' classes. So when I was thinking more and more about that research, when I was starting off with He Is Me a couple years ago, I did some empathy interviews with a bunch of different Black males, students, all the way up to folks working in central offices. And one empathy interview really stood out to me. It was from one of my former students who's now in college, and he said, I asked him about this phenomenon between Black male teachers versus non-Black male teachers, and he mentioned the fact that in his experience, the Black male teachers, he felt like let him and his friends kind of just be them, recognizing that they make mistakes and do things that children do, but without necessarily attaching a sense of criminality to it, and understanding when they are not majority of the time they're not being malicious. They're literally being children who are making mistakes and pushing boundaries and doing all the things that all kids do. So I challenged him a little bit on that. Although I agree with him, I didn't say it at this point. I challenged him a little because I knew that he had some white women teachers who would do the same thing, that he had great relationships with, who loved and respected him in the same way. So I asked him about how he could walk me through that fact compared to what he had just said about Black men. And he said that generally speaking, if if a Black male teacher and a white woman teacher said the exact same thing to him, gave him the same feedback, that he perceived it differently. He said, when oftentimes most of my teachers, when they do it, I feel like they're judging me or trying to control me. Whereas the Black male teachers, they're speaking from experience, so they're trying to help. And he knew that, he was very conscious to know that that's not always the case. But in the moment, that's the feeling he has by getting this feedback from these different people. And what was interesting about that is that actually speaks to the research that Black men, when they see themselves as teachers, when they see kids that look like them, then they do kind of lean into it a little bit more. And he also mentioned that if he and other Black males his age and early adults were to have the opportunities to see Black kids and see themselves in students, they'll be more likely to teach, which is something else that goes to the research, that when Black males have early teaching experiences, they do lean into teaching a little bit more. My story into education is much the same way. Oftentimes we make the impact as a tutor or a mentor or a summer camp counselor, see the impact that we can make, and then we want to build on it and become an educator in that way. Because in the way that they look at it, and again came from the empathy interview, multiple actually, that the job doesn't look appealing. They see the stresses. A few students mentioned, like, you all seem stressed out, I don't want to do that. Or, I know these kids get on your nerves, I don't want to do that. Or, I know you don't make money, I don't want to do that. So the job is just not appealing. And then when you layer onto that the traumas that they might have faced as students, whether that's not feeling welcomed in the school or feeling unseen or feeling like people aren't really listening or hearing them, and then try to ask them to come back and spend their careers there, that's going to be a very hard sell. So we need to make the job make a lot more sense for them. And there's a few other things. I'm going to give you 4 other steps that we can really take in terms of retention more so, because I believe that we need to start, you can't recruit without thinking about retention first. Having them in a classroom for a year could arguably be more harmful by these students building these strong relationships and then that person leaves. So you have to think about retention at the onset. And one of the things that needs to happen is managing the workload of Black men in schools. It's hard to be a 5th grade teacher and be an effective 5th grade teacher if you have 3 8th graders that's being sent to your room every class period because no one else feels like they could control them or calm them down or whatever the case may be. And oftentimes we become the unofficial deans of our school, which is a whole separate job. So now they're overwhelmed with all of these other duties that are not really equitable across the school. And then with that comes my second point, which is the support. By Black men often filling in those relationship roles for kids, now they have to learn how to navigate them. I think back to early in my career, I was about 24, and it was a student that I had, a young Black male who was about 17 or 18. And he had sent me a text at like 2 in the morning. It was something about, it wasn't an emergency or anything like that, but something was going on at home. And I didn't respond. And the next day I came to school and I went to the only other Black male in the building who was more experienced than I was, and just asked him like how to navigate that. Because my educator had it saying, like, don't text kids at 2 a.m. That's like a no-brainer for an educator, right? But then my personhood hat is saying he's reaching out to me for a reason. I know he doesn't live with his father. I know his whole background and his story. So I understand why he's reaching out. And that's a difficult thing to balance, to see how there am I going to be for this kid. And to have people who could help you navigate those situations would be helpful, whether that's training or mentorship. But those things layered onto the teaching, layered onto the unofficial dean, makes the job very, very heavy. The next thing I would say is to trust and value the input of Black male teachers. Don't just have diversity by look, but actually have a diversity of thought involved in decision making. Like, encourage Black male educators to incorporate their own lived experience, because that's valuable. A lot of times we have our own experiences as students, as former students, as educators. We can have candid conversations with our current students. I've had many meetings with parents and they will ask me, can you make sure no one else is in the room so we could just talk? So I'm gathering a lot of other information that's not official. So then when I go to make and not just me, but when we go to make suggestions for the school, then they come with questions. Where's the research? Where's the data? How do you know? And the lived experience is just as, if not more valuable than anything you could read in a book. Not to say that everybody has the same experience, because we don't, but it is valuable. It means something to the bigger story. And the last thing I would say is leave opportunity for growth for Black males. Think about what they want to do in a school, not just what your needs are as a school. I I went to college for teacher education, graduate school for curriculum, yet I was offered about 5 different dean of students positions that I've never applied for. I don't have a background in counseling or psychology or sociology or anything like that. But people quickly see me as a dean type of person over as an instructor. And we lose some Black male teachers who want to go the instructor route. Maybe that is being a coach or a superintendent of instruction or something like that, but being forced over to the discipline route and often fast tracked out of the teaching job into that role as well. So it feels like, I don't know if this is intentional, but it feels like we are moving up quickly in our careers, but it's really moving up quickly to a dead end position because they want you just to stay in that role, control the kids. The fallacious formula is that if the kids are compliant, then they are learning, but that's not necessarily the case. So yeah, I can go again. I could also go into a lot more detail, but I'll pause there.
Thank you. That was very informative and certainly makes the case why we need more Black male teachers. And I would just say, as a mom who cares about Black kids, that if you guys know of people, to always be channeling people, directing them to organizations like Roberts, and just doing what we can to increase the numbers and the interest. And with that, we'll go to the third question. We'll circle back at the end because we have a bunch of questions in the Q&A, but we'd like to try to get through everybody's question on the panel. So the third one is, how does white supremacy manifest in curricula? What are some steps we can take to disrupt and dismantle this? And this question is for Vanessa Williams.
Awesome. Hey everyone. Again, I'm just going to echo like everybody else too, and say that I'm, just so thrilled to be in community with you all, learning out loud, having this kind of surreal moment of doing this with you all. I think a lot of my thoughts tend to stay in my head, and every once in a while I'll, drop not an editorial, and people will be like, why don't you express your ideas more often? And I'm like, oh, okay, well, let's do this some more. So I say all that to say, again, I'm very much a student of, I am thinking out loud, learning out loud with you all, and hope that you find this all very valuable. I certainly am thrilled to share whatever I do have with you all. So as far as the questions go, I mean, I've been putting a lot of thought to that, to the ways that white supremacy manifests in curricula. And there's some very, apparent ways that are finally getting more attention, extended bouts of attention, over the past couple of years, right? We've seen studies come out about, textbooks and how, how terribly that they're written. And in fact, like when I was starting my my master's in education, my original idea was to be a textbook writer, right? I had that like as part of like my goal coming out of grad school. But the more I transgressed like through my program, the more I realized that I actually didn't want to limit myself, but not limit myself. I didn't want to be a textbook writer. I actually wanted to, be able to create my own curriculum, have my own domain, I guess, in that sense, because textbooks, like, it's almost like counterintuitive to like the way that I do my teaching, right? While they are helpful, like a helpful supplemental resource, saying, this book right here contains all the knowledge you need to have about world history or US history or any sort of subject matter is ambitious at best, right? But certainly not, and I mean, it's certainly not comprehensive enough. And, you know, it's reductive, or it's oftentimes reductive and doesn't really get at some really critical ways that you can be approaching curriculum, right? So yeah, there are these, you know, egregious ways in which white supremacy is manifested in the curriculum, right? We've seen the textbook studies. We've talked about how, you know, different standards have not been, you know, updated, or, you know, it doesn't really call on people to, you know, really nuance and critique and reckon with our history, or, you know, the lies of omission, or just, you know, generally talking about how you know, being a bit too kind to our history, right? And that's damaging. Or we know how damaging that could be, how damaging it has been for sure. And you know, I definitely want to acknowledge the power in that, and want to keep on encouraging people to continue doing that type of work, right? You know, saying we can't look back fondly at so much of U.S. history, right? If we're, you know, looking at that in particular, but I mean, honestly, a lot of different subject areas too. We need to be a lot more critical in how we're approaching it or how we're teaching it, right? But there's some other ways that I think has been like a much bigger practice for me, especially the past couple of years, where it's not necessarily just in the content itself, but like how it is that you are delivering it, and allowing kids that opportunity to critique and nuance stuff that, you know, often isn't. A lot of times in social studies curriculum, we'll have this very punctuated or very, you know, black and white, you know, this happened on this date, this happened here, right? And there's not a lot of context that's given to certain historical episodes or events that occur, right? But it's told like in this very straightforward way, and it's because, you know, maybe by virtue of that, these same stories being reproduced in very similar, if not identical ways from generation to generation, right? There's not a lot of, you know, there's not a lot of nuance. There's certainly not enough nuance, and certainly not enough people challenging how it's being told, right? I think a lot of people look back at history, and because it happened in the past, they imagine that it's static, right? Which isn't the case, right? So many things can, if you look back and you critically study history, there's no reason why we should be telling a lot of these stories the same way that we are, right? So not only are we not doing history justice by telling these lies of omission and being, you know, so, you know, wedded to being kind or being, you know, forgiving or absolving all these people of like the atrocities and things that, you know, that have been carried out, but like I think it's also really important that we, you know, invite kids to be the critiquers, like the people that are you know, that are analyzing different things or different episodes, and nuancing a lot of conversations, right? Like I think about, you know, a lot of our presidents, right? So for the first 5 years, I was teaching geography, and I can walk you through like a lot of the different, you know, lessons and units that I developed with that. Also taught world history as well in an 8th grade seminar. Right now I'm teaching civics. What a time to be teaching civics. Whew, it's tough, but it's okay. You know, I'm feeling a lot better about it now than I was before 2 days ago. But I think about like when we, when I'm talking about or when I'm delivering different lessons around our American, you know, founding principles and different people that have, you know, risen to power that, you know, are significant in history. A lot of people for far too long have been, you know, George Washington did, you know, this, and he was the first president, and he did X, Y, Z, right? And anybody that's, again, critically talking about reckoning with history, is also going to be able to, say, yes, he might have been, the first president. He might have, we have all these anecdotes about how he, never told a lie or, whatever, like all this stuff, right? But we also know George Washington, like, searched for on a judge, right, and escaped enslaved woman until his dying day, right? Like, so like we got to be able to hold both of those two things like at once, and like I think I am doing that as often as possible, as ethically as possible, as responsibly as possible in the lessons that I roll out with my kids, right? So I do invite them to always critique, and I set that expectation very, very early. The second week of school, we were looking at Washington's farewell address, and even if you aren't directly talking about white supremacy and the ways that it's manifested in U.S. history, I like to still say, you can look back at this document, you can look back at this episode in history, you can look back at, a lot of things that are that have occurred. And instead of unquestioningly following it, right, you can say, actually, that isn't right, right? Our Constitution was, ratified on this date, and it has all these like amendments and everything. But how is that? What was flawed, right? So many of these institutions were created, or institutions, practices, were created by deeply flawed people, and it's okay to question that and to say, we don't have to live, we don't have to continue like carrying on that tradition, right? And I think there's this idea that because something is tradition or something has been passed down from generation to generation, that we don't have to question it, and we can. One of the metaphors I love going back to, and I try not to get like too far deep into like extended metaphors because like I tend to get lost in them. But one thing I know that the US is often like billed as is like this American experiment, right? And what do you do with experiments? You change variables, right? You can change different parts of it, right, to better fit like what's appropriate for right now. Yeah, like the past this first part of the school year, I've been it's like our democracy unit, right? And I've been going through our founding principles, like the way the ideas from which we drew our notions of democracy, talked about some Enlightenment thinkers and all these like wonderful things that help lay the foundation, right, for our country. And I guess I found like different ways to like kind of in a roundabout way make them really defend what positions they have about the state of democracy, right? So I think so the theme for this past week was voter enfranchisement, and how is that tied to the strength of our democracy, right? And I gave them this article that walked through the major waves of enfranchisement throughout U.S. history, and in that, like the discussion question was, if we're looking at voting enfranchisement as like as a single metric, right? If we're only looking at voter enfranchisement, who is actually even eligible to register to vote? When did the United States become a full democracy? And I'm like, I want you to defend that position, right? If you say this year, say why, right? And a lot of people ended up saying, with the passage of the Voting Rights Act in the 1960s, that's when we became a full democracy. But this article also included, there are plenty of loopholes, and it's been essentially decimated now. And, there are a lot of people that are still excluded from, even eligibility to even vote, to even register to vote, right? So I say all of that to say, while like I've known like a lot of critical educators to like kind of, come out swinging and, say, let's go, right? Like with delivering different, their critical, pedagogy like to the kids, and kind of like saying everything very explicitly. I also like try to give my kids room to, I'm happy to share it from Business Insider. I also give my kids a lot of room to really take it in for themselves, and then be able to say, this is my argument, right? And I mean, no one has successfully convinced me, at least yet, like in all the discussion posts that I've read. Sorry, love you all dearly, but no one's convinced me that if they argue that we were a full democracy at any point, that no one's successfully defended that, right? There are a lot of people who have said, can I say never? And I'm like, actually, yeah. I mean, I don't want to tell you what to believe, right? And I can still assess that. I can still say, well, you made this argument and you defended it, and I can see like where you were going here. But leaving them room to nuance and critique things that like too many people are afraid to critique is like very key to me and the way that I deliver the curriculum. So I mean, some of the steps, I think I kind of just named them as far as like the actual content delivery, excuse me, was modeling critique very early on, expecting them to be able to do that, expecting that nuance as well for them, and giving them room. And if we're talking about, and I thought it was really beautiful how Jordan and Robert like did a wonderful job of talking about some of those like structural things that happen, like with teachers, and how they, I like when I think about not just the curricula that I developed, I also think about some of the practices and that I've got rolling, and we can hit on that a little bit later. But I hope I made some sense. I just have a lot of ideas that I'm happy to share. But I think about not just the like really glaringly egregious ways that are finally getting a lot more attention these days about textbooks and standards, and the misinformation that often comes out of the way that we've been teaching history for so long. But I also think about some of the other ways that you can really coach kids along and being critical students of history, and being a critical student of history yourself.
Yeah, Vanessa, I love that. And I think just the idea of just centering the criticality of even just looking at regular textbooks, and just what, you don't have to necessarily start if you feel like you're overwhelmed and you can't do all the research to learn. You're kind of learning with the students as well. Like you might just kind of pick apart and think critically about what you've been doing with the children or the students in the past. And that's really just a good way to even get started, that you don't have to jump into, creating all new material, and that you can start where you are and just think about it more critically and have them start a discussion about it, so that they're thinking, not taking everything so literally as the truth and the gospel, that actually, there's room to kind of think through it and see what other, kind of narratives you want to kind of lay on top of what they, are already learning. So I think that's a really powerful way to even just begin. But we would love to hear more about the curricula that you have created of your own. If you have time later on to share some of that, that would be wonderful. Or, also if you have a website, people can go to your website to even learn more about what you're creating. So thank you so much for that. Yeah, so our next question is, I think this one is just kind of a general question for everyone to kind of chime in if you're feeling like you want to share. We just wanted to talk a little bit about what we feel, what you think is the essential aspects of supporting and nurturing a positive identity for Black students and non-Black students, and why is this so important right now?
I could answer this question. I really appreciate it, especially now. But what is really essential for and able to support and nurture the positive identity for Black students is first with the teachers supporting and nurturing their own identities and having a deep understanding of their own identities. I think right now, and even I would say a little bit before now, we started to lean more into social emotional learning and restorative justice practices in schools and cultural responsive pedagogy, or whatever terms you want to use right now. We've already started leaning into that for the last few years, but we're skipping a crucial step a lot of the time, and that is the teacher having that understanding of self. If you don't have a deep and nuanced understanding of your own intersectionalities, there's no way you can understand somebody else's, and there's no way that you can get that person to understand their own. So instead of asking us, what can we do? A lot of the SEL type of things that I've seen come from schools and districts is very student facing. How can we get the kids to be more aware? The real question is, how do we get the teachers to? Because once the staff and the adults in the space are able to do this, and it might even be more natural than we even give credit towards, because you can see the complexities that that another person may be going through, or at least be able to hear them out. So again, I would just say start with the staff.
I think one not fully developed thought for me on this is that I think it's essential that when we talk about the racial identity development, Black identity development for students, that this isn't seen as a separate project altogether from what's going, like the core project of schooling and education, right? So by that I mean, it's not that, okay, by that I'm thinking about this academic disengagement literature, right? That's looks at Black students developing this sort of oppositional attitude towards education because they don't see schooling as being a part of what it means to be Black in America, right? And part of what I want to sort of push back on that literature on is that um, from what data I've seen, Black students are and families are just as, if not more, motivated to achieve academically than their white counterparts when they're young, right? And so we need to encourage this idea that to be Black is also to be successful in school, right? And to have this idea that your identity as a minority does not have to be developed someplace outside of what's going on in the main project of the school. Needs to be encouraged by the school system and by educators, like, as well, right? So that wasn't a fully coherent thought, but there's research on like racial ethnic self-schemas and like highly identified African American students who also feel integrated, like they are African American and the Americanness means something to them, and their identity as a student means something to them, and also their Blackness means something to them, perform well, better than students who don't have both of those components, right? And students need to also, as part of developing that, have a critical understanding of the racist factors that are shaping their experience so that they can learn that they don't have to internalize all this negative stuff around them as being about them as much as about the bias and structures that are also going on in society, right? So those are some not fully put together thoughts on that question.
I think for me, gosh, I mean, I think about it pretty often, I guess. Gosh, when I was like reading the question again, I thought back to this time. I was in the 3rd grade. I was the only Black person in my class, and I remember going on this field trip to a plantation, and I just remember feeling angry. Right, I'm just mad because, and I couldn't really understand it. Right, I like didn't really know what to do with that. Because I don't even remember like what kind of unit we were in social studies at that point. We were learning Florida history with some, I'm sure there was some sort of lesson or whatever about enslavement and Jacksonville, and we had gone to a plantation that that was historically like part of the city, whatever, right? But I think back to that experience and what it meant for me in that moment. Again, I couldn't really articulate it. I was 8, 9 years old, right? But I remember that time, and it reminded me, or it reminds me to be as, gosh, like sensitive to people's histories as possible when I am like crafting, my units or my lessons, whatever resources I'm bringing to the table, to still treat it, tenderly, right? Because it is something that still matters, right? The question that I kind of have like rolling around in my head at different points too is like, when do certain historical atrocities stop being tragic, or when do they stop being so heavy for people? And again, I don't think we can name a certain time or a certain year when like the Trail of Tears was, it's just a piece of history now. It's just something that we can just say, X number of Native peoples were killed on this trek out, to out west. And I'm from Jacksonville, like named after Andrew Jackson, the guy who oversaw that whole process, right? Or, just because slavery was abolished, or and, we're 150 some odd years removed from like the actual, I mean, we know how it's been reproduced, right? But like if we're talking about the ending of chattel enslavement, right? Just because it ended X number of years ago doesn't mean it's not something that we should still like be insensitive to, right? So I think about that a lot when I am approaching anything in my classes, and want to really reckon with it honestly, with dignity, and people who might be personally touched by it, or even if you aren't, I think we should all just be as sensitive as possible when we are approaching like different subject matter, and part of keeping that positive self-identity like in that moment too is like we need to remember that like in those moments, and history isn't just history, it is things that we are like still bound or like tied up in it. And I don't know, I just think about that a lot when I'm like crafting like my lessons. And I think about, how am I humanizing and how am I approaching this tactfully, when I am teaching something that's necessary, but also, could be touchy.
Thank you, everyone, for all of your thoughtful responses. It's such an important question to be carrying, really, and centering, and just making sure that we are looking to ways to create positive self-identities, and looking at the history, looking at excellence, so that even the non-Black students can really start seeing Black people in a new light, and not as just one dimensional. But I think I just love Robert, talking about just, naming how so many Black children are growing up, with single moms, and how, creating their own identity really starts even at home. And how can we support that through the teachers that they are exposed to, having more Black teachers, having more, Black students in the class, making sure that we're supporting the families and the teachers so that everyone is being supported. So yeah, that speaks to, the administration and, kind of like policies in schools, which hopefully, if teachers and educators will do this inner work of their own, taking our challenge or other things, so that they can kind of connect with their own self-identity, understand their own biases, unpack them, and learn how to kind of use all of that in a positive way, then maybe we can get to a place where, all students are really supported, and can grow into the full beings that they are meant to be. So we just want to acknowledge that it is 3 o'clock. We didn't really put a time limit on our conversation today, and we wanted to check in with our panelists to see if they're okay to stay for another 15 minutes or so. We have one more question, and then there's several questions in the Q&A that we wanted to get to. So if you guys can give us a thumbs up, or I'm not sure, we can keep going a little bit. We would love to. We have the time. So are you guys okay? And also,
yes, she's having issues seeing the chat.
Okay. And then also, if the panelists, if the participants, if you can't stay, don't worry. This is being recorded, so you can always come back and listen to the last section. But we want to make sure that we get to the questions, but we also want to honor everyone's time. Great. So I guess we'll go ahead, and Kirsten's going to ask the questions because I'm having an issue getting into the chat myself. First, before that, we actually have one more question that speaks to right now. Yeah, the COVID.
What is essential to supporting and nurturing equity for Black students and non-Black students during COVID-19 and distance learning? And we'll just put that one out there for whoever wants to jump in on it.
Cool. I'll go ahead and take it away.
My audio was off. You didn't hear me What is essential to supporting and nurturing equity for Black students and non-Black students during COVID-19 and distance learning? Thank you, Jordan. I didn't see the note. So I'll put that out there for whoever wants to.
Good deal. Yeah. So I like did a lot of clearly things have been changing with in education, especially since March, in this era that we're in. I was fortunate enough to like gotten some really great PD that's just been really helpful in making those transitions from being fully in person with my kids to having like a fully remote experience. And now we're in the school that I'm currently at, we're in a hybrid format. So like 50% of kids come on Monday and Tuesday, 50% come on Wednesday and Thursday. We have some that are still fully remote, and then Fridays are like teacher work days, right? For me, it's really more, I think a lot about how important it is to center experiences and people that are like typically relegated to the margins, right? And if you center those people, those experiences, then everyone was ideally going to be able to perform at their best, right? To have those supports in place for people who again need those supports, right? So for me, it is just like thinking through as many scenarios as possible when I am crafting whatever it is that I'm rolling out to my students, and being prepared for whatever like might come during the week, I guess. So I think a lot about if I look for summarizing it, it is to center those experiences and to be mindful of what supports are necessary, and how everyone does benefit when we do center those people. Do you want me to give specific examples of like, things that I do, or I'm happy to? I just wasn't sure if that was.
Yeah, I think that would be great. And also just thinking about, how do you support and kind of just take a temperature of like where they are, like emotionally, are they engaged? Are they, feeling Zoom fatigue? How can you just check in with them to make sure that, everyone's thriving? What are you doing specifically just to kind of address some of these new challenges that this kind of COVID and distant learning,
Mm-hmm.
and even a hybrid situation creates, even just creating community too with the class? How can you support that?
Yeah. So, I'm thinking about different, approaches that I've had. Honestly, I started off the school year, and I started at a new school this school year. So, and started out being fully remote, so it was very hard to make those connections. But honestly, like what I have been doing is just being as intentional with whatever it is that I'm crafting as possible. I think like the beauty of how I've been rolling out my curriculum, on top of it being critical and nuanced and all these wonderful things, it's also, really founded on this idea of mastery, and how do kids like demonstrate their mastery of like the content, and like keeping that in mind. There are like still a lot of other practices that I've got that like help them with with the learning process, right? So so when I say mastery, I mean it means kind of reframing like how schooling, it's certainly how different it means reframing like what I personally experienced like when I was a student. So I don't necessarily like have points like for different assignments, right? Like a lot of that is like kind of gaming the system, and they can choose not to do an assignment, and if they don't do it, then so what, they don't get those 5 points. But if they do this project at the end of at the end of the week, then they'll still like have a good grade in the class, right? There's no way to game the system with me. Like I'm very intentional with like what it is that I roll out to kids, and I assess the different standards like in different ways like throughout each unit that I do, right? And I don't think I assign as much work when it comes to like, what it is that I'm actually grading. But if you choose not to do an assignment, like it actually does like impact your grade, right? So, but there's no punitive, um, uh, there are no punitive grading practices that I've got, right? So like whenever people do turn in an assignment, they can get full credit for it. Like if they, check if they've met all the, criteria, the requirements for that assignment, right? There's no, penalty, or there's no, if this is a well done assignment, but you missed the deadline, it means you can only get like a 50% on this, right? You can still get an A on the assignment, even if it's, like past the deadline, right? Or it's also like you're keeping common accommodations in mind, right? I will take like different texts, like from like the textbook that I've been using, the civics textbook, and doing a lot of editing, by the way, because it's so necessary. But having like the actual readable text, available for people to read themselves, but also an audio recording of that for people who like have that necessary accommodation, or like that helps them like process the information a little bit better, right? And that's more work on me as a teacher, right? And like I'm retyping whole chapters of a textbook, and also reading, like giving them like a little Audible subscription, I don't know. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, and it means putting that putting a lot of that out there. But you just got to be thoughtful, and you got to be intentional with what it is that you roll out, and keep your priorities straight, right? Because I mean, so much of, when I'm thinking about like when I was coming through as a K-12 student, like there are so many things that like I just would question, like why are we doing this? Like why are we why can't I get credit for turning in this paper that was due at 5 o'clock? If I turned it in at 5:03, why is it a 0, right? It's still a great paper. It came 3 minutes later. You didn't start grading it until the weekend after, so it's fine. Like it's, you got to do like a lot of questioning around like what it is that we're doing and how it is that we're approaching it. And those are, I guess, like some of the specific things that I have been doing. Again, I've got plenty of other examples. I'm happy to give my email to give any more examples if anybody wants to reach out to me about that. But in my head, I think, who needs the most support? How can I be most supportive to them? How can I provide those accommodations that they need? And with that, the people who don't need those supports, like they're fine, right? And I still show them their love, and send those positive emails to them and recognize them for what they are offering, and make sure that those people who do need the Audible version or the audio version of the textbook chapter, or a different way of submitting an assignment, it's fine, right? It means more work, it means more patience, more grace, more compassion from me, but that's just what comes with the territory right now. It's, no one was really trained for this. And there are things that you can adopt to make it a little bit easier, or a little bit the transition into this type of teaching a little bit smoother. But it's just being intentional and centering those people.
Yeah, I love that. And I love how you also just give a variety, so that students, if they don't finish something, that there's, almost like a little list of different activities that they can do to get graded and to submit for grades, so that there's, kind of that that diversity just in the lessons that they can choose from. So that was really interesting. I hadn't heard about that. So thank you for sharing that. That's a great idea. Robert or Jordan, do you guys have anything to chime in and share?
Yeah, I could share a bit on this. I appreciate that response just now from Vanessa. That was partially what I had in mind. But the other thing I'm thinking, when we talk about what's essential to supporting and nurturing equity in distance learning, first thing I would do is ask that same question for in-person learning. And when we do that, we think about things like school structure, where students are situated in the building, what the physical structure of the school, what the lighting is, things like that. We think about school culture. What kind of environment do we want? What's the vibe of the school, the feel of the school? We think about access to resources, which students get, what supports from people or physical supports is going to help them through the work. We think about noise level. So there's a lot of factors that we can think about in person, but what we have to accept that in distant learning, we don't have control over many of those factors. So with that being said, the best way I would say that we could support and nurture students is lean into the fact that we don't have control over a lot of the structures that we do have control over in person, and open up the different open up to accept that there are different means to the same end. So if we know we want students learning X or gaining these type of characteristics in their personhood, what are the different ways that that could happen? Different students have different environments at home, different resources at home. Given all those infinite number of situations that could exist for a child, how could you still have that student have opportunity to show their learning or their growth? Vanessa's idea of having multiple different opportunities to do work is one example of that. Another thing could be different ways to show their learning, whether that's something written, something on video, a project, an assignment, and obviously it depends on what you're trying to measure. But keep in mind that there are plenty of means to an end. We a lot of times at schools get caught up in the how. We do it this way. Somebody earlier spoke about tradition, and what we're trying to do a lot of times is replicate what happens in person now, because that's just the way we do things. But we lose sight of why we're even doing that in the first place. And is that way necessary? Is it the best way to do it? Is it fitting? Does it make sense? Is it fair? So we need to go back to that piece of it. Think about what the means is, what is our end goal, and what are all the different factors that we do not have control over. And despite not having control over those things, how can we then think about the different means for a student to reach the goals that we set?
I think these are all
Thank
brilliant.
you, Robert.
The only thing I would add, really small, is that, you know, we talk about distance learning during the time of COVID-19. We're in a period of crisis, um, and so that requires all the things that Vanessa and Robert have said from us. It requires generally having compassion and grace and flexibility. But one thing, and so I'm not a high school teacher anymore. I used to be. Now, I'm a graduate student, but I still work with high schoolers once a week. And one thing I've built into that practice with my high schoolers is having some mindfulness practice in our time, particularly to deal with racialized trauma is what we've been focused on, but just in processing everything that's going on right now. The world is upside down in extraordinary ways. So the more that we can broaden our bandwidth, teaching is already requires a lot from you. You give a lot to your kids, more than just the instruction, right? And this is another extraordinary time calling teachers to do extraordinary things. So anything we can do to provide students that sort of support to deal with the active, ongoing, chronic, and just ginormous crisis of the world right now, I think is necessary.
Yeah, thank you so much for centering that, Jordan. That's so crucial. And it's really important for teachers to really have those kind of like grounding practices too, that are, your self-care. How are you taking care of yourself so you can show up for your students? Yeah, so thank you for highlighting that. That's really essential. So now I think, Kirsten, we have some questions in the chat.
I think, Lynn, we only committed to 3:15 and we're at 3:17.
Oh gosh.
So we're already over. So just want to thank everybody. This has been such a wonderful panel, and we just feel really, blessed to have you guys here and sharing this information. We hope that people will check out our challenge and take it to their schools, their families, within their school community. We have a series of other conversations coming up. You'll see we have Dr. Peggy McIntosh. We're very excited about the whole panel, but we are always looking for people who are doing this really critical, important work and trying to bring that to people, because it's so important, and it's really just a passion for us to do this and to try to be part of a solution. So with that, we just want to thank everybody, our panelists, of course, and for everybody who tuned in. Like people have said, on the Sunday afternoon, we'll send out an email with the link, and you can email us if you have questions. And with that, thank you and enjoy what's left of your weekend. And we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks, y'all.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.